Can you cook? The Alpha King asked, his voice low enough to silence the entire hall, and for one breathless second, the bride standing beneath the chandeliers forgot how to breathe. The question should have sounded ordinary. Instead, in that room full of polished silver, candlelight, and wolves dressed in velvet, it landed like a verdict. Elena kept her hands folded at her waist so no one would see them tremble. She could still feel the humiliation from moments ago, the way her stepmother had smoothed down her own silk gown and whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Try not to embarrass us," as if Elena were some stray they had dragged in from the rain. The pack had already decided what she was. The poor bride, the unwanted one, the girl with no dowry, no shining name, no reason to be standing near the Alpha King's table at all. And yet there he was, watching her with dark, unreadable eyes from the head of the long banquet hall, his expression calm while the room held its breath around him. Elena had been told all her life that worth was measured in polish, in bloodlines, in how gracefully a woman could smile while being ignored. So when his question reached her, she almost thought she had misheard it. One of the ladies near the front let out a soft laugh. Someone else covered their mouth, already expecting Elena to fail. After all, what could a bride like her know about the kitchen of a royal house? The grand feast spread before them gleamed with roasted vegetables, fresh bread, herb-glazed chicken, and crystal bowls of fruit, but none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was the silence, the waiting, the way every face turned toward her as if she were about to trip over the only word she had left. Elena lifted her chin. She had spent years in a small apartment with a stove that wheezed in winter and a window that rattled in the wind. She had learned how to stretch a bag of rice into 2 meals, how to make soup taste warm even when the pantry was nearly empty, how to turn simple ingredients into something that made tired people sit down and smile. Cooking had never been a talent anyone praised. It had been survival. It had been care. It had been the only thing she could make that felt like home. "Yes," she said at last, softly but clearly, and the hall seemed to shift. The Alpha King's gaze sharpened, not mocking now, but interested. That was worse somehow. Better, too, because in his attention, Elena felt the first crack in the wall that had boxed her in for years. Her stepmother's smile stiffened. The ladies at the table leaned closer. The king set down his glass with deliberate care, as if he had already decided this night was no longer about ceremony or appearances. "Then tell me," he said, "what would you serve someone who has forgotten how to feel cared for?" The question hung between them, strange and intimate, like it belonged to a private room instead of a public feast. Elena looked at him, really looked, and saw not a ruler carved from power, but a man carrying something heavy behind his controlled expression. For the first time that evening, she forgot the humiliation, the whispers, the glittering judgment around her. She only thought of warmth, of salt, of memory, of the quiet kind of love that could be carried in a bowl, offered without apology. And when Elena finally answered, her voice was steady, enough steady to make the entire hall go still. Elena did not lift her eyes right away. She stood beneath the chandeliers with her hands folded so neatly at her waist that no one would guess how hard she was gripping her own fingers. The room had gone quiet in the way a forest goes quiet before a storm. Every wolf in the hall suddenly aware that something had shifted. Across the table, the Alpha King watched her with the same calm intensity he had used before, but now there was something sharper in it, something waiting. Elena swallowed and let the memory of the mocking voices fall behind her like a door she could no longer open. They had laughed when she was brought forward. They had looked at her plain dress, her lowered chin, her careful silence, and decided she had nothing worth offering. Yet the king had not dismissed her. He had asked her a question no one else in the room would have thought to ask. And because he had asked it, she answered him as honestly as she knew how. "Something warm," she had said, her voice small at first, then steadier when she saw that he was listening. "Something simple. Food that does not need to impress anyone. Soup, perhaps. Bread if it is fresh. A bowl set down by a fire when someone has had a difficult day." The hall had stayed silent after that, but Elena had felt the silence change. It was no longer the silence of ridicule. It was the silence of attention. Now the king leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression unreadable, and the wolves around the room shifted as if they could feel the air tighten around him. "Go on," he said. Just 2 words, low and steady, but they sent a strange tremor through the tables. Elena glanced toward the long line of servants near the wall, then toward her stepmother, whose smile had turned thin and uncertain. No one had ever asked Elena to continue. No one had ever wanted more than a quiet nod from her, or a useful pair of hands, or a reason to send her away. She drew in a slow breath, letting the scent of roasted herbs and wine settle her nerves. "If someone is tired," she said carefully, "then I would give them something that asks nothing from them. A meal that does not make them prove they deserve it." A murmur moved through the room. Not loud, just enough to be felt. The king's gaze sharpened, and for the first time Elena saw the faintest change in his face, as if her answer had touched something he had not meant to reveal. His fingers rested on the edge of the table, still and deliberate. "And if that person had spent years pretending they were fine?" he asked. Elena looked at him then, really looked, and saw the tiredness hidden behind his composure. Not weakness. Something older. Something guarded. Her heart gave one sudden, painful beat. She had spent her whole life learning how to recognize hunger in others because no one had cared to notice her own. This was hunger too, she realized. Not for food. For gentleness. For a place where he did not have to be carved from stone. The candles flickered overhead, throwing gold light across his face, and Elena felt the whole room waiting for her to fail. But she did not fail. "Then I would not ask them to prove it to me," she said softly. "I would sit beside them and wait until they were ready to stop pretending." The words settled between them like something sacred. Even the stepmother had gone still. The king said nothing for several long seconds. He simply looked at Elena, as if she had stepped through a door no one else could see. Then, with a slow movement that drew every eye in the room, he set his glass aside and gave the smallest nod. It was not applause. It was not praise. It was something far more dangerous. Recognition. Elena felt it in the way his attention stayed on her, in the way the room seemed to tilt around that single, quiet moment. The servants exchanged glances. One of the ladies at the table looked offended that a girl like Elena had been allowed to speak with such ease. Her stepmother's mouth tightened with displeasure. But the king did not look away. "You understand more than most," he said at last. Elena's throat tightened. She almost answered with a polite denial, the kind she had given all her life. But something in his voice held her still. It was not the voice of a man making conversation. It was the voice of someone testing the shape of her heart. So she only nodded once. Outside, beyond the great windows, the night wind moved through the trees. Inside, the feast seemed to fade around them. The glittering silver, the polished crystal, the careful laughter. Elena had the unsettling feeling that the room had already changed, and that she had changed with it. She did not know why the king had singled her out. She did not know why his questions felt less like interrogation and more like a door opening in a locked wall. But she knew, with a certainty that made her chest ache, that she was no longer invisible to him. And somewhere in that realization, small and trembling as a flame held against the dark, Elena began to feel the first fragile shape of hope. By the time the servants carried in the final course, Elena had learned the weight of silence. It was not empty silence, not here. It was the kind that pressed softly at the edges of a room, waiting for someone to break it and change everything. She kept her posture straight and her hands still, though her pulse had not settled since the king first addressed her. Around her, the nobles resumed their careful eating, but their glances kept drifting back, unwilling to leave her alone with him for long. The Alpha King did not look away. He sat at the head of the table as if he had all the time in the world, one hand resting near his glass, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he asked, "Who taught you?" Elena blinked. The question was so gentle that it took her a moment to understand it. "To cook," he added, as if he knew she might choose not to answer the first time. A few heads turned. Elena felt them listening, felt the subtle shift in the room as if the hall itself had leaned closer. She should have given the easy answer. She should have said her mother, or the family cook, or no one at all, which would have been almost true. But honesty rose in her before caution could stop it. "My grandmother," she said quietly. The king's gaze sharpened, not with impatience, but with something like interest deepening into recognition. "What did she teach you?" Elena looked down at the untouched bowl in front of him. Steam lifted from it in a thin silver line, carrying the scent of broth and herbs, simple things made careful by patient hands. For a moment, she was no longer in the grand hall beneath crystal lights. She was small again, standing beside a stove that was too hot for her face, listening to an older woman hum while she stirred a pot with a wooden spoon worn smooth by years. She remembered flour on the counter, a cracked bowl, the feeling of being useful in a house where she was otherwise forgotten. She said food should never be proud, Elena said softly. It should comfort first. It should make room for people who are tired. The words seemed to settle over the table before anyone could stop them. One of the women near the end of the hall lowered her fork. A man across from her looked suddenly uncomfortable, as if he had been caught misunderstanding something he had no right to judge. The Alpha King did not move. His attention stayed on Elena with quiet, exact focus, and for the first time since entering the hall, she felt less like a guest and more like a person being truly seen. Comfort first, he repeated, almost to himself. Then he lifted the spoon. He tasted the broth. The room seemed to tighten around that small motion. Elena held her breath, not because she feared criticism, but because she knew what it meant to have something of herself placed in another person's hands. The king's eyes lowered for a brief moment, and when he looked up again, something in his expression had softened, just enough to be dangerous. "You learned that from love?" he said. It was not a question. Elena could not speak. Her throat ached with the sudden, fierce memory of a kitchen lit by morning sun, of a grandmother's patient hands, of all the quiet places where she had once been cherished without conditions. The king set the spoon down with care. "That is rare," he said. The words were simple, but they landed like a crown being lowered onto bare skin. Elena felt the room change around her again. Not with applause, not with open approval. Something subtler, and perhaps more powerful. Curiosity. Respect, thin as a thread but real. A few wolves who had looked through her before now watched her, as if they were seeing shape where they had assumed there was only shadow. Elena kept her face calm, though her heart was beating too fast. She had not expected this. She had not expected kindness from a man like him, nor interest, nor the strange ache that came with being noticed after so long in the dark. The king leaned back slightly, his gaze never leaving her. "If you were to make one dish for someone who had been through a very long night," he said, "what would you choose?" Elena opened her mouth, and for a second the answer hovered at the edge of her lips like a secret waiting to become truth. Elena opened her mouth, and for 1 second the answer seemed to tremble on the edge of her tongue. Not from fear, from memory. She could almost see the small kitchen at the edge of her grandmother's cottage, the worn wooden spoon in her hand, the steam rising from a pot that had once felt like comfort itself. The king watched her with that same unreadable stillness, waiting. Around them, the hall remained silent, but it was no longer the cold silence of judgment. It had shifted into something sharper, something alert. Elena lowered her gaze to the table, to the untouched silverware, to the polished bowls reflecting the glow of the chandeliers. "If someone has been through a very long night," she said at last, her voice soft but clear, "I would make soup first. Not something grand. Something warm enough to return a person to themselves." A few heads turned. The king did not speak. He only looked at her a moment longer, as if weighing the shape of her words against the shape of her life. Elena continued before doubt could catch her. "A broth with onions cooked slowly until they turned sweet. Garlic, thyme, carrots, potatoes, and just enough salt to remind them they are still here." The hall seemed to lean in with her final sentence. Not because the recipe was extravagant, but because it was not. It was simple, honest. The kind of answer no one in this room had expected from the bride they had mocked in whispers since morning. One noble woman lifted a brow. Another set her goblet down with care, suddenly thoughtful. The king's mouth moved, almost like he was suppressing the smallest change in expression. Elena did not know if it was approval, curiosity, or something even more dangerous than either. But she felt it. The room had begun to listen. "And if they were still afraid," he said quietly, "what then?" Elena held his gaze this time, though her pulse struck hard beneath her ribs. "Then I would not force them to eat," she said. "I would leave the bowl nearby. I would let the warmth do its work." A breath moved through the hall. It was tiny, but Elena heard it. Not one person looked away now. The king studied her as if she had just spoken in a language only he could understand. Then, with deliberate calm, he reached for his own spoon and tasted the soup that had been placed before him. The gesture was so small that no one else might have noticed what it meant. But Elena did. She watched the pause in his throat, the quiet stillness in his shoulders. Then he set the spoon down and said, "It is familiar." Elena's eyes flicked up before she could stop herself. Familiar. Not good. Not impressive. Familiar. The word landed in her chest with a strange, aching softness. "My mother used to make something like this," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the room for just a moment. "When I was too young to understand why it mattered." The nobles around them seemed to forget how to breathe. Elena did too, because something in the king's tone had changed. It was not the voice of a ruler testing a stranger. It was the voice of a man remembering the shape of comfort after too long without it. And when he looked at her again, the distance between them felt smaller than before. Not safe, not simple, but smaller. Elena felt the first faint stir of courage move through her, careful as a hand reaching toward fire. She had answered a question, nothing more. And yet somehow, the whole room had tilted. The king leaned back in his chair, never breaking eye contact, and said in a voice meant for her alone, "Stay after supper, Elena. I would like to know what else you can make." Elena did not move when the servants appeared to clear the table. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her posture careful, her breathing quiet, as if any sudden motion might break the strange spell that had fallen over the room. The king had asked her to stay after supper. Those words still lingered in the air like the last note of a song. Around her, nobles exchanged glances behind lowered hands, still trying to understand what had happened at the table, still unsettled by the way the room had shifted the moment Elena spoke. She felt their curiosity pressing in from every side. But what unsettled her most was the king himself. He had not looked away from her once. Not while she answered. Not while he asked the next question. Not even now, when the servants moved in and the hall began to empty. When the final tray was carried away, the king rose from his chair with quiet authority and gave a small gesture for everyone else to leave. The nobles obeyed at once. Chairs scraped softly across the polished floor. Silk brushed against silk. Perfumed laughter faded into the distance until only Elena remained seated beneath the glow of the chandeliers and the steady gaze of the man across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was different now. Not sharp, not cruel. It felt suspended, as if the night itself had paused to listen. Then the king said, "You did not answer like someone trying to impress me." Elena lifted her eyes at last, and her heart gave a small, startled beat. "I was not trying to," she said. His mouth changed, almost into a smile, though it never fully formed. "That," he said, "is precisely why I asked." Her fingers tightened together in her lap. She did not know what he meant, and she was beginning to suspect that was the point. He stepped away from the table and crossed the room with measured, unhurried steps. Elena could hear the soft sound of his boots against the floor, each one drawing him closer until she could feel the warmth of his presence before she looked up. He stopped beside the window, where the moonlight fell across his shoulders in a pale silver line. "Tell me something, Elena," he said quietly. "When you cooked tonight, what were you thinking about?" The question was so simple that it made her chest ache. No one had ever asked her something like that before. Not in the manor, not in the village, not in any room where she had been expected to serve, smile, and disappear. She looked down for a moment, gathering herself. "I was thinking," she said slowly, "that hunger is not only about the body." The king turned his head toward her, listening. Elena felt heat rise into her cheeks, but she continued. "Sometimes a person is hungry for kindness, or for being remembered, or for a meal that tastes like someone cared enough to make it slowly." The words left her before she could stop them, soft and honest, and when she finished, the silence that followed felt deeper than before. The king's gaze remained on her, unreadable and intense, as though he were hearing more than the words themselves. Finally he said, "And did someone once make you a meal like that?" Elena's throat tightened. For a moment she almost said no. It would have been easier, safer. But something in his expression, something steadier than pity and more careful than curiosity, made the truth rise anyway. "My grandmother," she said, "when I was small." The king nodded once, as if he had expected that answer. "Then you understand memory better than most people in this castle." Elena did not know what to say to that. She only knew that the compliment felt unlike any she had ever received. It did not land like praise. It landed like recognition. He reached for the nearby sideboard and lifted the small porcelain cup that had been left there. Instead of drinking, he turned it slowly in his hand, thoughtful. "There is a kitchen wing in the East Hall," he said. The head cook is gone for the night, but I want you to show me something tomorrow morning. Elena blinked. Show you? Yes, he said, still watching her. Something ordinary. Something that would tell me who you are when no one is looking. Her pulse quickened, but not with fear this time. Something more fragile. Something almost dangerous. Hope, perhaps. It rose in her chest before she could stop it. She searched his face for mockery and found none. Only patience. Only interest. Only that strange, disarming stillness that made it impossible to pretend he did not see her. What if I do not know what you want to see? She asked, her voice low. Then, he said, you will make what feels true. The answer settled over her like warmth. Elena lowered her gaze, but she could not hide the faint tremor in her breath. The king noticed. Of course he did. Nothing about him suggested carelessness. His expression softened by the smallest degree, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter still. You have spent too long being told what you are supposed to be, he said. I am interested in what remains when you are allowed to be yourself. The words struck something deep inside her, something she had not known was still tender. Elena looked up then, fully this time, and found him already waiting. Not demanding, not judging, waiting. It was the most dangerous kind of attention she had ever received, because it did not pressure her to perform. It invited her to exist. Outside the tall windows, the night pressed dark and soft against the castle walls. Inside, the last candles burned low, and the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. Elena felt, with a sudden and unsettling clarity, that tomorrow would matter, that this was no longer only about a question over supper. Something had begun here, quiet as embers beneath ash, and the king knew it as surely as she did. He set the porcelain cup back on the sideboard and took one final step closer, stopping just far enough away to keep the moment respectful, deliberate. Come early, he said, and do not bring the opinion of anyone else with you. Elena held his gaze, her heart beating far too hard to be called calm. Then, at last, she gave the smallest nod. It was not much. Not on paper. Not in the language of courts and crowns. But in the stillness of that moonlit room, it felt like the first door opening. Elena arrived early, just as he had asked. The kitchen corridors were still half asleep, washed in the soft gray light before dawn, and the castle felt different without the noise of supper and the sharp eyes of the court. Here, the air smelled of warm bread, crushed herbs, and wood smoke. For the first time in days, her shoulders loosened a little. She had expected a room full of judges again, or at least a servant waiting to remind her of her place. Instead, she found the king alone near the long preparation table, sleeves rolled back, one hand resting on a bowl of ripe pears as if he had been there for hours. He looked up when she entered, and something quiet passed across his face. Not command, not curiosity, something steadier. You came, he said. Elena stopped just inside the doorway, uncertain whether she should bow or speak. You asked me to, she replied softly. The corner of his mouth shifted, almost a smile, though his eyes stayed serious. Yes, he said, and you obeyed without asking why. That should not have felt like praise, but it did. She lowered her gaze, suddenly aware of how rough and practical her hands looked beside the polished silver bowls arranged along the table. They were hands that had peeled potatoes, stirred stews, kneaded dough until her fingers ached. Hands no one in the court had ever bothered to notice. The king reached for one of the pears and turned it slowly in his palm. Yesterday, he said, you answered a question everyone else had made too complicated. So today, I want to see what you do when no one is watching. Elena looked up at him then, her pulse giving a small, startled jump. No one is watching, she repeated. I am, he said, and his voice was calm enough to be dangerous. Not because it threatened her, but because it held her attention so completely. He set the pear down and gestured toward the counter. There is a family recipe in this kitchen archive that has not been prepared in years. It is simple, but the instructions are incomplete. The cooks have argued over it for months. He paused, studying her face. I want you to finish it. Elena stared at him. Why me? The question escaped before she could stop it. For a moment, he said nothing. Outside, a cart rattled somewhere in the outer courtyard. Inside, the silence gathered around them like a private thing. Because when you spoke last night, he said at last, you sounded like someone who knows what feeding a person means. Elena felt that sentence land somewhere deep in her chest. Not because it was grand, because it was true. Her grandmother had always said that a meal was not just food. It was mercy, offered in a form the body could accept. Elena moved to the table slowly, as if stepping into a dream she had not been brave enough to name. There were onions, cream, fresh dill, a basket of apples, and a covered dish of smoked fish. The scent alone was enough to stir memory. She lifted the lid, and warmth rose into her face. "I know this," she whispered before she could think better of it. The king did not interrupt. He only watched as she washed her hands, tied back the loose ribbon at her wrist, and began to work. At first, her movements were careful. Then memory took hold. Knife against board, butter melting in a small pan, the soft crackle of onions turning translucent, a pinch of salt, a little more than a pinch, enough dill to brighten the whole room. She added lemon at the last moment, just as her grandmother had taught her, because even comfort needed a small sharp note to feel complete. The kitchen grew quiet around her. Even the servants who had drifted nearby to witness the king's unusual interest in the humiliated bride seemed to forget to breathe. Elena sensed their attention, but it no longer made her shrink. Not here. Not while her hands knew exactly what to do. When the dish was ready, she spooned it into a shallow porcelain serving bowl and set it on the table. The king stepped closer, his gaze steady on the steam rising between them. "Taste it," he said. Elena hesitated. It had been too many years since anyone had asked her to taste her own work with pride. She dipped the edge of the spoon into the sauce and lifted it to her lips. For 1 second, everything else disappeared. The flavor was soft and bright and deeply familiar, like a memory returning home. Her breath caught. The king saw it immediately. "Well?" he asked quietly. Elena looked at the bowl, then at him, and something in her expression changed, small but certain. "It is ready," she said. He took the spoon from her hand and tasted it himself. His eyes lowered for a moment, and when he looked back up, there was unmistakable approval there. "It is more than ready," he said. "It is exactly what it needed to be." The words should have been ordinary. Instead, they struck her with such force that she almost forgot how to stand. No one in that castle had ever spoken to her as though her choices mattered. No one had ever looked at her work and seen more than usefulness or pity. The king placed the spoon down and said, "Serve this tonight in the private dining room." Not as a servant, as the one who made it. Elena's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "That will cause talk." "Let it," he said, almost gently. "Talk is easy. Truth is harder and far more valuable." She lifted her eyes to his face and found no mockery there, no test disguised as kindness. Only patience, only intent. The kind of intent that made her feel, for the first time, that she was standing on ground that might actually hold her. Somewhere beyond the kitchen windows, the sun had begun to rise, brushing the stone walls in pale gold. And in that light, Elena understood that this was no longer just about answering a question at supper. He was teaching the court to look at her differently. Yes, but more than that, he was asking her to step into a place she had never been allowed to occupy. Not in the shadows, not at the edge, in the open. The realization left her breathless. The king noticed. His voice softened, lowering as if he did not want the room to steal the moment from her. "You do not have to become anyone else here, Elena," he said. "Not for me. Not for them." Her throat tightened. For a heartbeat, she could only stare at him, the warmth of the stove on her skin, the scent of dill and butter and morning rising around her like a blessing. Then she gave the smallest nod. It was not surrender. It was trust. By the time the first light touched the castle windows, Elena had already been in the kitchen for an hour, standing beside the long oak table while the king watched her from the far side of the room. The servants moved quietly now, almost reverently, as if they had begun to understand that something had shifted overnight, though none of them would have dared say so aloud. Elena kept her hands folded at her waist, trying not to notice how different he looked here, away from the court, without the hard shine of ceremony around him. In the warm, ordinary light of dawn, he seemed less like a ruler carved from stone and more like a man who had chosen to stay. The thought unsettled her more than it should have. He had asked her to cook, not perform, not prove herself. Cook. And that single word had opened a door inside her she had kept locked for years. The king nodded toward the ingredients laid out before her. Eggs, fresh herbs, a wedge of cheese, bread cooling near the hearth. Simple things. Honest things. "What will you make?" he asked, his voice calm, almost gentle. Elena looked at the table, then at the stove, and for a long moment said nothing. Her mind was not in the kitchen anymore. It was back in a smaller room, with a cracked window and an empty cupboard, with her mother showing her how to stretch one egg into a meal for 3 people, with the sound of hunger trying to make a home in every corner. She remembered how food had never been just food. It had been comfort. It had been proof that someone cared enough to keep going. That memory steadied her. "Something warm," she said at last. The king's gaze sharpened, not in judgment, but in interest. Elena moved to the counter and began with practiced hands, cracking eggs into a bowl, whisking them with a little cream, salt, and cracked pepper until the mixture turned pale and silky. She chopped herbs with care, the knife tapping softly against the wood. The room filled with the clean scent of chives and butter, and for the first time in days, her breathing slowed. She was not being watched as a spectacle now. She was being watched as if what she made mattered. The servants had noticed too. One paused near the doorway. Another lingered with a stack of cloths, pretending not to stare. Even the king said nothing for a while. He only observed, his expression unreadable, his attention fixed on the rhythm of her hands. Elena melted butter in a pan and poured in the eggs, stirring slowly as they thickened into soft curds. She folded in the herbs and cheese, then toasted slices of bread until the edges turned gold and crisp. It was an unremarkable dish by palace standards, the kind of thing that would never be placed at the center of a banquet. But there was care in it. Memory. Mercy. She plated the food with more patience than ceremony, then placed the plate before him and stepped back as if afraid to take up too much space. The king looked down at it for a long beat. Then he picked up the fork and took one bite. The kitchen seemed to hold its breath. Elena felt her pulse in her throat, foolishly aware of every sound, every movement, every second that passed. He did not speak at once. He took another bite, slower this time, as if confirming something only he could taste. Then his eyes lifted to hers. "This," he said quietly, "is what a home tastes like." The words landed so softly that for a moment Elena did not understand them. Then they did, and her chest tightened in a way that almost hurt. Not because of the praise, because of the memory inside it. Home. No one had said that word to her in years without making it sound like something she had lost for good. She looked away before he could see how close she was to tears. But he saw anyway. He always seemed to see more than he should. "When did you learn to cook like this?" he asked. Elena let out a slow breath. "When I was young," she said. "My mother said food should never shame the person making it. She said even the smallest meal can tell the truth about the hands that made it." The king's expression changed then, just slightly, as though something in her answer had reached him more deeply than he expected. He set the fork down and leaned back, studying her with that same quiet intensity he had worn the night before at supper. "And what truth would this meal tell?" he asked. Elena glanced at the plate, then at him. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she answered. "That someone was hungry," she said, "and someone cared enough to notice." For a moment, no one in the kitchen moved. Even the servants seemed to forget how to breathe. Then the king rose from his chair, not hurriedly, not theatrically, but with a deliberate calm that made the entire room feel smaller around him. He walked to the stove, looked at the pan, then at the tray of herbs, and finally back to her. "You notice things others miss," he said. "That will matter here." Elena did not know what to say to that. Her life had taught her that noticing too much only led to being hurt more deeply by what others ignored. But his voice carried no trap in it, only certainty. He turned slightly, addressing the nearest servant without looking away from Elena. "Have another table set," he said. "She will not cook for an audience." The servant bowed and hurried off. Elena stared after him, startled. "Your Majesty," she began, but he lifted one hand, stopping her gently. "No one here will turn your work into entertainment," he said. "Not while I am in this room." The promise in those words wrapped around her like warmth. She had spent so long bracing for ridicule that protection still felt unfamiliar, almost dangerous in its tenderness. Yet there it was, plain and unwavering. He was not asking her to endure the court. He was changing the room around her, changing the way the room saw her. Elena lowered her eyes, suddenly overwhelmed by the quiet force of it. When she looked up again, the king was already watching her with that same composed stillness, as if he had been waiting for her to understand that this was only the beginning. And somewhere beyond the kitchen walls, beyond the gray stone and the waking castle, The morning bell rang once, clear and distant, like a sign that the whole day had shifted toward her. By the time the castle had settled into evening, Elena no longer felt like a guest standing at the edge of someone else's world. She still moved carefully, still carried that old instinct to make herself smaller than the space around her. But the kitchen had begun to feel different. The air was warmer here, softer. The servants no longer rushed past her with that earlier look of curiosity sharpened into doubt. They watched her now with a quiet, uncertain respect, as if they were waiting to see what kind of woman could make the king pause at a stove and listen. Elena kept her eyes on the herbs in front of her, slicing them with steady hands while the scent of roasted onion and fresh thyme rose into the air. Beside her, the king stood with his sleeves rolled once at the forearm, his presence calm and unmistakable even when he said nothing. He had remained in the kitchen longer than any king should have, asking no questions, offering no commands, simply watching her work with an attention that felt almost disarming in its patience. "Add the stock slowly," Elena said at last, her voice quiet but sure. "If it is poured too fast, the soup loses its balance." He glanced at her, and something in his expression shifted, not in surprise, but in recognition, as if he understood that she was speaking about more than soup. She reached for the ladle, demonstrated the motion once, and the liquid turned gold in the pot, catching the light from the stove like a small, living flame. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft simmer of the broth and the distant murmur of the waking castle. Then the king said, almost casually, "You speak like someone who has spent years learning how to survive quietly." Elena's fingers stilled. The question in his voice was gentle enough to be mistaken for nothing at all, but it found the tender places she usually kept hidden. She did not look up right away. She only breathed in the steam rising from the pot and let it steady her. "Quiet survival is still survival," she said. The words hung between them, simple and true. When she finally lifted her gaze, she found him already looking at her with an expression she could not name, one that did not ask for pity and did not offer it either. It only held space for her truth. At the far end of the kitchen, a servant entered with a tray and nearly dropped it when he saw the king by the stove. The man froze, pale with alarm, but the king raised one hand without even turning. "Leave it there," he said evenly. The servant obeyed at once and hurried away as if afraid to breathe too loudly. Elena almost smiled at that, but the feeling did not last long. The room had become too still, too full of something unspoken. "Why are you doing this?" she asked before she could stop herself. The king did not answer immediately. He looked down at the pot, then back at her, his face unreadable in the firelight. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady. "Because no one should be dismissed for the things they know with their hands and heart." The words struck her more deeply than any praise could have. Elena felt them settle somewhere inside her, where all the old shame had lived for too long. She thought of the laughter from yesterday, the careless cruelty, the way they had expected her to shrink and fail. None of it seemed to matter here. Not in this kitchen. Not under his gaze. The broth began to thicken, the first real sign that the meal was coming together, and Elena moved to stir it again. The king stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, only enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her side. It was an oddly careful kind of closeness, as if he understood that trust, once frightened, could be broken by the smallest pressure. "Tomorrow," he said after a moment, "I want the court to taste this." Elena turned sharply. "The court?" He gave a faint nod. "Let them remember what they overlooked." She stared at him, the spoon suspended above the pot. The idea was so unlike the life she had known that it felt almost unreal. Her work served to the very people who had judged her before she had even spoken. The thought made her pulse quicken, not with fear this time, but with a fragile kind of hope that hurt to hold. If the court accepted this meal, then they would be tasting more than food. They would be tasting the truth that had stood beside her all along. Elena lowered the spoon and looked into the glowing broth. In its surface, she could see a blurred reflection of herself and, beside it, the dark shape of the king who had chosen to stand here instead of above her. And for the first time, she wondered if the life she had been surviving might finally be turning into something she could call her own. By midnight, the castle had gone quiet enough that Elena could hear the soft crackle of the hearth and the distant turning of winter wind against the stone. The court had tasted the meal. They had spoken in lowered voices at first, then with open surprise, then with that rare silence that came when pride had finally been outshone by something honest. Elena had stood at the edge of the hall through all of it, her fingers clasped so tightly that her knuckles ached, watching nobles who had once looked through her now lean forward for another spoonful. It had not felt like triumph. It had felt like something gentler and far more dangerous. Acceptance. Real acceptance. The kind that did not vanish the moment the room grew cold. Now she stood in the quiet kitchen with her sleeves rolled to her forearms, the last copper pot washed and drying beside her, while the king remained by the window, one hand resting against the frame as he looked out into the dark. He had not spoken for several minutes. Neither had she. Somehow, that silence no longer frightened her. It felt like the pause before a promise. Finally, he turned. The lamplight caught the lines of his face, the steadiness in his eyes, the kind of restraint that always seemed one breath away from becoming something deeper. "You listened to the room tonight," he said softly. Elena lowered her gaze to the cloth in her hands. "I listened to the people who mattered." A faint warmth touched his mouth, almost a smile. "That is not usually how courts work." "No," she said, and this time her voice was steadier than before. "But it is how meals work, and perhaps how trust works too." The king studied her for a moment, as though he were still discovering the shape of her courage. Then he crossed the kitchen and stopped a careful distance away, not crowding her, not asking for more than she could give. "Tomorrow," he said, "I want you at the high table." Elena looked up too quickly. "I am not noble." "No," he replied. "You are better than noble. You are the reason they will be forced to remember what they value." The words settled over her like warm cloth. They were not polished enough to belong to a ceremony, and perhaps that was why they reached so deep. Elena felt her throat tighten. She had spent so many years being told where she belonged that she had almost forgotten the shock of being chosen for a place she had never dared to imagine. "They will stare," she whispered. "Let them," he said. "They have spent enough time staring at the wrong things." Her breath caught at that, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the low murmur of the fire. Then he reached into the inner fold of his jacket and drew out a small silver pin shaped like a crescent moon. He did not place it in her hand. He waited until she met his eyes. "This is not a chain," he said quietly. "It is a sign. If you wear it, no one in this castle will mistake your place again." Elena stared at the pin, the moonlight catching its edge until it glowed like a sliver of dawn. Her pulse rose with a strange mix of fear and wonder. It was only metal, only a small thing. But in that room, it felt larger than a crown. Her fingers moved slowly as she took it from him. The silver was cool against her skin. "And if I am not ready?" she asked. His answer came at once, calm and certain. "Then I will wait." Elena held the pin in her palm, and for the first time since she had crossed the castle gates, the future did not feel like a wall. It felt like a door standing open. In the morning, the great hall would fill again. Voices would rise. Eyes would turn. But now she knew something they did not. She was no longer there by accident. She was there by choice. And standing beneath the same roof as the king, with the moonlight spilling across the floor and the scent of rosemary still lingering in the air, Elena understood that her life had already begun to change. Not in a blaze, not in a proclamation, in a careful, deliberate way, like dough rising in the warmth of a kitchen, like trust settling into the heart, like a name being spoken with respect for the very first time.